The more they love you, the worse they treat you. The first time it happens, it feels almost impossible to explain to yourself. The person who once chased you, opened up to you, stayed up all night talking to you, made you feel chosen in ways you hadn't experienced before, slowly starts becoming colder the closer you get. The warmth that pulled you in starts flickering unpredictably. The affection becomes inconsistent. The emotional distance grows at the exact moment the relationship should be deepening. And what makes this dynamic so psychologically devastating is that nothing about it follows normal emotional logic. Usually love softens people. Usually emotional safety creates closeness. Usually when someone values you deeply, they become more careful with your heart, not less. But with avoidance, deep love can activate the exact opposite reaction. The more emotionally important you become to them, the more their defenses begin taking control. And if you've ever sat there wondering how someone could love you deeply while simultaneously making you feel emotionally abandoned, this video is going to explain the hidden psychology behind that contradiction. Because the painful truth is this: avoidants are often not coldest when they feel nothing. They are coldest when the feelings become too overwhelming for them to regulate. And before we dive into this, subscribe if this channel keeps giving language to relationship experiences that made you feel crazy before you understood the psychology behind them. Because honestly, most people never realize they're dealing with avoidant attachment until they've already been emotionally pulled into the storm. To understand why avoidants often treat people worse the deeper the love becomes, you first have to understand one brutal reality about avoidant psychology. Intimacy does not automatically feel safe to them, it feels dangerous. To emotionally secure people, closeness usually creates comfort. Vulnerability creates bonding. Dependence feels natural inside healthy connection. But avoidants often learned very early in life that emotional needs create pain, pressure, disappointment, loss of freedom, or emotional overwhelm. So instead of associating love with peace, their nervous system quietly associates deep attachment with risk of being controlled, risk of being consumed, risk of losing themselves emotionally, risk of depending on someone too much and eventually getting hurt. That's why avoidants can genuinely crave love while simultaneously becoming destabilized by the emotional weight of it once it becomes real. Their heart wants connection, but their nervous system experiences that same connection as a threat to survival. And this contradiction creates enormous internal chaos because avoidants often do not consciously understand why they start reacting negatively toward relationships they actually value deeply. They just know that once emotional closeness reaches a certain intensity, something inside them starts screaming for distance again. The relationship begins feeling emotionally too much, even when nothing objectively unhealthy is happening. And because most avoidants struggle verbalizing these fears openly, their discomfort leaks out behaviorally instead. Through withdrawal, irritation, emotional inconsistency, coldness, silence, mixed signals, the very behaviors that leave their partner feeling unloved are often the same behaviors being triggered by how emotionally significant the relationship has become to them internally. What makes this even more confusing is that avoidants usually seem almost ideal in the beginning. In fact, many people describe the early stages with avoidance as intoxicating because there's often a surprising amount of emotional intensity before real attachment fully settles in. At the start, avoidants can appear attentive, charming, emotionally available, deeply interested, even vulnerable. They text constantly, they initiate, they seem excited by the connection. And for the person on the receiving end, it feels incredibly genuine because in many ways it is. The avoidant is not necessarily pretending during this stage. The difference is that early connection still feels emotionally safe because the relationship hasn't yet crossed into deeper dependency or long-term vulnerability. Emotional intimacy is still exciting rather than threatening. There's enough space, enough mystery, enough emotional freedom for the avoidant nervous system to stay relaxed. But then something slowly changes. Feelings deepen, routines form, emotional attachment becomes real. The relationship starts carrying emotional consequences. And this is where the shift begins that confuses so many people. The same avoidant who once seemed emotionally open suddenly becomes harder to reach. Their energy changes, they pull away after closeness. They become emotionally inconsistent right when the relationship starts feeling more meaningful. And because the contrast between the beginning and the present feels so extreme, their partner often becomes trapped trying to get back the version of the avoidant they first met, not realizing the emotional shift itself was triggered by the relationship becoming genuinely important. This is the stage where avoidant psychology starts operating almost entirely through defense mechanisms instead of conscious intention, because once emotional bonding becomes deep enough, love itself starts activating fear inside them. Not fake fear, real nervous system level fear. The deeper the attachment grows, the more emotionally exposed they begin feeling. Suddenly your opinions matter too much. Your presence matters too much. Your absence would hurt too much. And for someone who spent years surviving through emotional self-protection and hyper-independence, that level of emotional dependency can feel terrifying. So instead of leaning closer into the relationship, avoidants often begin creating distance from the very person they love most. Not because the feelings disappeared, but because the feelings intensified beyond what feels emotionally manageable to them. This is why avoidants often become colder after emotionally intimate moments instead of warmer. Vulnerability leaves them emotionally overstimulated. Deep conversations, emotional closeness, affection, reassurance, future planning, these things increase attachment, which increases fear, and instead of recognizing the fear directly, the avoidant nervous system automatically starts searching for relief. Relief usually comes through emotional distance. Suddenly they need more space, more independence, more emotional breathing room, and from the outside it feels cruel because their partner experiences this withdrawal right after moments that felt meaningful and connective. One person feels closer than ever while the avoidant suddenly feels internally flooded and desperate to regulate themselves again. That's why one of the deepest hidden fears inside avoidance is the fear of losing independence through love. People often misunderstand this and assume avoidants simply do not care deeply, but many avoidants care so deeply that emotional closeness begins threatening their entire sense of internal stability. Love starts feeling consuming instead of comforting. They fear becoming emotionally trapped. They fear expectations growing endlessly. They fear needing someone too much. And perhaps most of all, they fear losing control over themselves emotionally. Because once you become deeply important to an avoidant, you suddenly gain the power to emotionally affect them in ways they spent years trying to avoid altogether. Your mood can change their mood, your distance can create anxiety, your disappointment can trigger shame, and that level of emotional influence can feel unbearable for someone who built their identity around emotional self-sufficiency. So ironically, the more they love you, the more urgently their defenses begin trying to reclaim emotional control. They withdraw not always because they want less connection, but because they fear the intensity of how much the connection already matters. And this is the heartbreaking paradox that traps so many relationships with avoidance. The behaviors that hurt you most are often being triggered by the depth of their feelings, not the absence of them. And once this cycle begins, one of the most confusing patterns starts taking over the relationship. The closer you get emotionally, the more distance they suddenly seem to need. At first it feels subtle. After a deeply connected night together, they become quieter the next day. After opening up emotionally, they disappear for hours or days. After moments that seem intimate and reassuring, their energy shifts almost without warning. And if you do not understand avoidant psychology, this behavior feels deeply personal. It feels like rejection, like punishment, like emotional manipulation. But internally, many avoidants are not consciously trying to hurt the person they love. They are trying to regulate emotional overwhelm the only way their nervous system knows how, through distance. The problem is that their coping mechanism directly injures the very relationship creating those intense feelings, because to their partner the pattern feels emotionally backwards. The moments that should deepen closeness instead trigger withdrawal. The moments that should build security instead create anxiety. And over time, this inconsistency begins reshaping the emotional atmosphere of the relationship entirely. You stop relaxing into love. You start bracing for withdrawal after every good moment. You become hyper-aware of emotional shifts. You notice when texts become shorter, when affection cools, when silence stretches longer than usual, and eventually your nervous system starts living in anticipation of abandonment even while the relationship still exists. What makes this even more painful is that avoidants often punish vulnerability without fully realizing they are doing it. Not necessarily through cruelty in obvious forms, but through emotional retreat at the exact moments vulnerability appears. Someone opens their heart to them and suddenly the avoidant becomes emotionally unavailable. Someone expresses deeper feelings and the avoidant becomes sarcastic, distracted, irritable, or detached. Someone seeks reassurance, and the avoidant reacts as though emotional intimacy itself has become exhausting. And for the partner, this creates devastating emotional conditioning because vulnerability stops feeling safe. Instead of emotional closeness leading to comfort, it starts leading to disconnection. So people begin suppressing their own needs just to preserve the relationship. They stop asking difficult questions, stop expressing fears, stop seeking reassurance. They become emotionally smaller, hoping it will stop triggering distance. But this never truly solves the problem because the issue is not the existence of emotional intimacy, it's the avoidance unresolved fear around it. And underneath all of this, avoidants are often fighting an internal war they do not fully understand themselves. Part of them genuinely craves connection, craves closeness, craves being loved deeply. But another part panics the second that love becomes emotionally real enough to threaten their carefully maintained sense of independence and control. So they swing back and forth internally between longing and avoidance, warmth and withdrawal, connection and escape. This internal battle is exhausting not only for the person loving the avoidant, but for the avoidant themselves, because deep down many avoidants are painfully aware that their reactions do not make logical sense. They know they are pulling away from someone they genuinely care about. They know the relationship feels safer when emotional pressure is low, yet they also feel lonely when too much distance exists. And this contradiction creates enormous shame internally because avoidants often experience themselves as emotionally defective without saying it aloud. They wonder why closeness feels so overwhelming, why they need space after intimacy, why they become irritated by the very emotional connection they spent so much time craving. And instead of understanding these reactions as attachment wounds, they often interpret them as signs that something must be wrong with the relationship itself. So they start emotionally distancing even further in an attempt to regain clarity. But clarity rarely comes through avoidance. What usually happens instead is emotional numbness followed by delayed grief later on. And in the meantime, the partner is left emotionally starving beside someone who genuinely loves them but cannot tolerate the vulnerability that love requires consistently. That's why relationships with avoidants often feel emotionally tragic instead of simply toxic. There is real affection underneath the walls, real longing, real attachment, but fear keeps interrupting the expression of it. And ironically, avoidants often behave worst with the people who love them safest. This is one of the saddest truths in avoidant psychology because the very presence of emotional safety can activate old wounds that never surfaced in more casual relationships. With emotionally unavailable people, avoidants often feel calm because true vulnerability never fully activates. There's enough distance to maintain emotional control. But with someone patient, loving, emotionally consistent, and genuinely invested, the avoidant nervous system suddenly begins confronting deeper fears it spent years suppressing. Fear of being fully known. Fear of disappointing someone who truly cares. Fear of emotional dependency becoming unavoidable. So instead of relaxing into safety, the avoidant often becomes increasingly dysregulated by it. The safer the relationship feels emotionally, the more their unconscious defenses begin trying to create space again. And this can completely shatter the partner emotionally because they assume love should naturally improve the relationship over time. Instead, they experience the opposite. The more loyal they become, the colder the avoidant sometimes grows. The more understanding they are, the more emotionally distant the avoidant becomes, and eventually they start blaming themselves for a problem that was never truly caused by their lack of love. In fact, many avoidants pull away hardest precisely because the relationship finally mattered enough to expose fears they could no longer emotionally outrun. At the center of all this is a nervous system that quietly associates love itself with pressure. Not because healthy love is inherently suffocating, but because avoidants often learned early in life that emotional closeness comes with overwhelming expectations, emotional engulfment, criticism, loss of autonomy, or emotional instability. So even healthy relationship needs can start feeling threatening once emotional attachment deepens enough. A simple request for reassurance suddenly feels emotionally heavy. A conversation about the future feels suffocating. Consistency starts feeling like obligation instead of care. And because these reactions happen internally and automatically, avoidants often struggle explaining them even to themselves. They just know that the relationship starts feeling emotionally intense in ways they cannot regulate comfortably. So instead of communicating the fear directly, their nervous system instinctively moves toward emotional escape routes. More space, more distraction, more emotional distance. And tragically, the person they love most becomes the person most affected by these defenses. Not because the avoidant lacks feelings, but because the feelings became too emotionally powerful to carry without triggering old survival mechanisms. And eventually, even the smallest emotional needs begin triggering reactions that feel wildly disproportionate to the situation itself. That's one of the clearest signs you're no longer dealing with simple emotional distance. You're dealing with an avoidant nervous system actively struggling against attachment. A normal request for reassurance suddenly feels too demanding to them. Wanting consistency feels like pressure. Wanting emotional presence feels overwhelming. And from the outside, this becomes incredibly confusing because the things you're asking for are often basic parts of healthy relationships. A little communication, a little emotional clarity, a little reliability. But once avoidants become deeply attached, those ordinary relationship expectations can start activating panic internally because every emotional need reminds them that the relationship now carries emotional responsibility. And responsibility feels dangerous when someone unconsciously associates closeness with losing freedom. So instead of calmly addressing needs, they begin reacting defensively. They withdraw, become irritated, delay conversations, act emotionally exhausted by discussions that would feel manageable to securely attached people. And over time, the partner begins shrinking themselves emotionally just to avoid triggering more distance. They stop asking for reassurance, stop expressing hurt openly, stop bringing up unmet needs. They become hyper-focused on staying emotionally easy because every emotional request now risks another wave of withdrawal. And slowly, without realizing it, the relationship transforms into an environment where one person's emotional comfort depends entirely on the other person suppressing themselves. This is exactly what creates the infamous push-pull dynamic that leaves so many people emotionally addicted to avoidance, because avoidants rarely remain emotionally distant permanently. The moment too much space exists, another part of them starts missing the connection again. They begin feeling lonely, disconnected, emotionally empty, so they move closer again. They reconnect, become affectionate, open up emotionally, show warmth that makes it feel like the relationship is finally stabilizing. And just when their partner finally exhales emotionally and begins relaxing back into closeness, the withdrawal starts again. More space, more emotional distance, more unpredictability. And this cycle becomes psychologically devastating because intermittent affection affects the nervous system more intensely than consistent affection. The unpredictability itself creates emotional obsession. The good moments feel euphoric precisely because they are constantly threatened by disappearance. So the partner starts living emotionally between hope and anxiety. Every reconnection feels like proof the relationship can still work. Every withdrawal feels like emotional punishment they desperately try to avoid causing again. And the avoidant often does not consciously realize how destabilizing this pattern becomes because internally they are simply reacting to fluctuating feelings of overwhelm and longing. But for the person loving them, the relationship starts feeling emotionally impossible to stand on steadily. One week feels deeply intimate, the next feels emotionally abandoned, and over time, this unpredictability slowly erodes emotional security from the inside out. One of the strangest and most painful parts of avoidant psychology is that they often become coldest directly after the most emotionally intimate moments. After deep conversations, after vulnerability, after affection, after closeness that genuinely felt meaningful. To the partner, these moments feel like breakthroughs, like the walls are finally coming down. But to the avoidant nervous system, intimacy can create emotional overstimulation once attachment deepens enough. So immediately after closeness, a powerful urge for distance often appears almost automatically. And this creates one of the most heartbreaking emotional experiences imaginable because the partner naturally interprets withdrawal after intimacy as rejection. Imagine opening your heart to someone, feeling closer than ever, and then suddenly watching them emotionally disappear right afterward. It creates confusion so intense that people start questioning their own reality. Did I imagine the connection? Did I say too much? Did I ruin the moment somehow? But the painful irony is that avoidants often withdraw not because the intimacy meant nothing, but because it meant too much. Emotional closeness leaves them feeling exposed in ways they struggle tolerating for long periods. So they instinctively move toward emotional numbness again to regulate themselves. The tragedy is that the person they love most becomes associated not only with comfort, but also with overwhelming emotional vulnerability. And because avoidants fear vulnerability deeply, they start reacting defensively toward the very moments their partner experiences as emotionally beautiful. Underneath all of this sits another hidden fear avoidants rarely admit even to themselves, the fear of being fully seen. Real intimacy requires emotional visibility. It exposes insecurities, emotional needs, dependency, fears, weaknesses, contradictions, the very parts avoidance spent years learning to hide or suppress to survive emotionally. So when someone starts truly knowing them deeply, it can feel emotionally terrifying rather than comforting. Because now the avoidant cannot fully control how they are perceived anymore. Someone sees behind the mask of independence. Someone sees the fears underneath the detachment. Someone sees how deeply they actually care. And for avoidants, being emotionally known often creates enormous internal vulnerability because it threatens the emotional self-protection they built their identity around. That's why many avoidants become strangely restless when relationships start feeling emotionally calm and secure. The more emotionally safe the connection becomes, the more emotionally visible they feel. And instead of relaxing into the safety, they begin unconsciously searching for ways to recreate emotional distance again. They may focus on flaws suddenly, become emotionally distracted, pick small